Imagine flying at 30,000 feet when suddenly a deafening bang shakes the entire plane. The next thing you know, a swarm of birds, unlike anything you've ever seen, is attacking from all sides. The pilot is fighting to keep control. Passengers are screaming and the windows are cracking under the relentless assault. But what happens next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about air travel. Jason's day had started like any other, a routine flight that he had made countless times before. The skies were clear. The weather was perfect and everything seemed to be in order. As the plane ascended smoothly to its cruising altitude, Jason glanced at his co-pilot, Sarah, and gave her a reassuring nod. They had flown together many times, and there was a comfortable, almost telepathic understanding between them. Little did they know, this flight would soon become a terrifying ordeal that would test their skills and courage to the very limit. As the plane reached cruising altitude, a loud, bone-chilling bang reverberated through the aircraft. Jason's head snapped toward the windows, his heart pounding as he tried to determine the source of the noise. At first glance, everything outside seemed normal, but his instincts told him something was very wrong. Sarah noticed his alarm and followed his gaze to the radar screen. Her face went pale as she pointed to an ominous sight. A massive swarm of birds, far larger than anything they had ever seen before, was heading straight for them. "Sarah, what the hell is that?" Jason muttered under his breath, his eyes wide with disbelief. "I don't know, but they're coming in fast," she replied, her voice shaky. The sight was unlike anything they had ever encountered. A dark, shifting mass of wings and beaks, moving with unnatural speed and precision, hurtling toward the plane. Before they could even react, the birds hit with the force of a battering ram. The entire aircraft shuddered violently as the swarm collided with it, a cacophony of thuds and screeches reverberating through the fuselage. Panic erupted in the cabin. Passengers screamed and clung to their seats as the plane lurched and dipped under the onslaught. Jason's mind raced. Bird strikes were a known hazard, but this was different. This wasn't just a few errant birds. This was a coordinated, relentless attack. The windows began to crack under the repeated impacts, spider webbing with fractures that threatened to give way. "Mayday! Mayday!" Jason shouted into the radio, his voice tinged with desperation. He frantically tried to contact air traffic control, but all he got in return was a mess of static, the interference from the birds drowning out any coherent communication. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized they were on their own. Sarah was struggling to maintain control of the aircraft. Her hands were white-knuckled on the control yoke, her face a mask of concentration. "We need to get out of this swarm, Jason," she shouted, her voice barely audible over the roar of the birds and the groans of the plane's structure under the relentless assault. "I know, I'm trying," Jason yelled back, his mind working furiously for a solution. "We need to climb! Get above them!" He pulled back on the controls, and the plane began to climb. But the birds followed, their numbers seeming to swell as they pursued the aircraft. It was as if they were being driven by some malevolent force, intent on bringing the plane down. The higher they climbed, the more intense the attack became. Jason's heart sank as he realized climbing wasn't going to work. The birds were matching their every move, and the plane was struggling against the weight of the swarm. He quickly tried a different tactic, diving the plane to try to shake them off. The aircraft plummeted, and passengers screamed as they were thrown against their seatbelts. But the birds clung to the plane, their bodies slamming against the windows and fuselage with sickening thuds. "We're not shaking them, Jason." Sarah's voice was tight with fear. The plane continued to lose altitude rapidly, and the ground was rushing up to meet them. Jason knew they were heading straight for a densely populated area, and the consequences of a crash didn't bear thinking about. "We need to find a place to land now," Jason shouted, his eyes scanning the terrain below for any potential landing sites. "Sarah, do you see anything?" Sarah's eyes darted across the instruments and out the windows, searching desperately. There's an open field just outside the city. It's not ideal, but it's our best shot." Jason nodded and immediately radioed air traffic control again, praying the message would get through this time. "This is Flight 262. We're going to attempt an emergency landing in a field outside the city. Clear the area and have emergency services on standby." The reply came back, crackling through the static. "Copy that, Flight 262. We're clearing the area now. Good luck, Jason." With the decision made, Jason focused all his attention on bringing the plane down safely. He could feel the tension in the cabin as the passengers braced for what was to come. The plane's descent was rapid, the ground rushing up at an alarming rate. Jason's heart was in his throat as he fought to keep the plane steady, knowing that one wrong move could lead to catastrophe. The impact was brutal. The plane hit the ground with a bone-jarring crash, skidding across the field, sending up a plume of dirt and debris. The passengers were jolted violently, screams of fear and pain echoing through the cabin. But miraculously, the plane held together. Jason's heart pounded as he realized they had survived the initial impact. But the danger wasn't over. As the emergency slides deployed and the passengers began evacuating, the birds reappeared. They swarmed around the plane like a living storm, their screeches filling the air. Jason couldn't believe what he was seeing. The birds were still attacking even after the plane had crash-landed. He watched in horror as the passengers fled down the slides, some of them stumbling and falling in their haste to escape. The flight attendants were doing their best to maintain order, but the situation was rapidly descending into chaos. The birds were everywhere, their beaks and talons slashing through the air as they dove at anything that moved. Jason and Sarah were the last to leave the cockpit, helping passengers down the slides and trying to shield them from the attacking birds. Jason's mind was racing. Why were the birds so intent on the plane? What could possibly be causing this? As the last passengers made it to safety, Jason noticed something strange. The birds seemed to be concentrating their attacks on a specific area of the plane, the cargo hold. His heart skipped a beat as a horrifying thought crossed his mind. Could there be something in the cargo hold that was attracting the birds? Once the last passenger was evacuated, Jason ran to the nearest emergency responder. "We need to check the cargo hold," he panted. "The birds are after something in there." The responder gave him a puzzled look, but quickly radioed for backup. Within minutes, a team of heavily armed officers arrived at the scene, moving cautiously towards the plane's cargo hold. The birds were still swarming, but their numbers were thinning out as some began to lose interest. Jason stood back, his heart pounding as the officers approached the cargo hold. They pried open the doors, and the sight that greeted them left them speechless. Inside the cargo hold were crates filled with exotic birds, crammed together in tiny cages. The birds were screeching in terror, their wings flapping wildly against the bars. The officers quickly realized that these were no ordinary birds. They were rare, endangered species that had been smuggled illegally. Jason felt a cold chill run down his spine as the realization hit him. The wild birds outside weren't attacking. They were trying to free their captive kin. The smuggler, who had been posing as a regular passenger, was quickly identified and detained. It turned out he was part of a notorious wildlife trafficking ring using commercial flights to transport his illicit cargo. As the smuggler was led away in handcuffs, Jason finally allowed himself to breathe. The immediate danger was over, but the ordeal had left everyone deeply shaken. The passengers were huddled together, some of them crying, others simply staring blankly at the smoldering wreckage of the plane. The birds, sensing that their mission was complete, began to disperse, flying off into the sky one by one. But the nightmare wasn't truly over. The discovery in the cargo hold had opened up a much larger investigation. The crates of birds were just the tip of the iceberg. As the authorities began to dig deeper, they uncovered a complex and sinister web of illegal wildlife trafficking that spanned continents and involved some of the world's most dangerous criminals. The authorities realized that this was no ordinary smuggling operation. The birds weren't just being transported for sale, they were part of a larger, more sinister experiment. The crates in the cargo hold contained not just live birds, but also advanced genetic equipment and vials of unknown substances. The implications were horrifying. As the investigation unfolded, Jason was called in to testify about what he had witnessed during the flight. He recounted every detail, from the moment the birds first appeared to the terrifying emergency landing. His testimony helped the authorities piece together the story, but it also raised more questions than it answered. The more the investigators uncovered, the more they realized the true scale of the operation. The smuggler had been part of a shadowy organization that used commercial flights to transport their illicit cargo across international borders. The birds had been genetically modified, their DNA altered in ways that defied understanding. The organization behind the smuggling operation was larger and more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Their activities extended far beyond wildlife trafficking. They were involved in illegal genetic research, using the birds as test subjects for their experiments. The authorities knew they were dealing with something far more dangerous than they had initially thought. As the investigation deepened, more arrests were made. The documents recovered from the cargo hold pointed to a global network of criminal activity involving powerful and influential individuals. The authorities pursued every lead, but the true masterminds behind the operation remained elusive. The story of that fateful flight became a sensation, a chilling reminder of the dangers that lurk just beneath the surface of everyday life. The media dubbed it the bird flight, and it captured the public's imagination. But for Jason, it was much more than just a story. It was a life-changing experience that left him forever altered. Jason continued to fly, but the memory of that day never left him. The image of the birds, their desperate fight for freedom, was etched into his mind. He found himself looking at the world differently, more aware of the hidden dangers that could strike without warning. The ordeal had brought him closer to his fellow passengers and crew, and they remained in touch long after the investigation had ended. As for the birds, they were released back into the wild, free at last after their harrowing ordeal. The memory of their desperate struggle to escape the cargo hold stayed with Jason, a reminder of the power of nature and the lengths to which some would go to exploit it. The investigation eventually led to a series of high-profile arrests, but the true masterminds behind the operation remained elusive. The documents recovered from the cargo hold were filled with cryptic codes and references to locations around the world, but the authorities were unable to decipher them. In the end, the investigation was closed, but the mystery remained. The birds had been just one small piece of a much larger puzzle, and the true extent of the operation was never fully uncovered. Jason returned to his normal life, but the experience had left him changed. He continued to fly, but the memory of that day stayed with him, a constant reminder of how fragile life could be and how easily it could be taken away. The ordeal had brought him closer to his fellow passengers and crew, and they remained in touch long after the investigation had ended. As for the birds, they were released back into the wild, free at last after their harrowing ordeal. But the memory of their desperate struggle to escape the cargo hold stayed with Jason, a reminder of the power of nature and the lengths to which some would go to exploit it. In the end, the story of the flight became a legend, a tale of survival and the enduring power of the human spirit. But for Jason, it was more than just a story. It was a reminder of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface and the need to stay vigilant in the face of danger.